Oh, hey there, gang. We got an old one. It's pretty rare, too. This was made in early 1919, so it just turned 102 years old. It's a Vega brand guitar. Vega, you say? Yes. Well, they're probably best known for their banjos, but they did make guitars at this time, too. The Vega company was formed in Boston in the 1880s by a number of transplanted Swedes, principally a pair of brothers, the Nelson brothers. No, not those ones. Their names are Julius and Carl. One of these days, I need to make a study of turn-of-the-century Boston makers, because that was a really jumping place in terms of stringed instrument manufacturers in the turn-of-the-century era. A lot of mandolins and banjos. Other things, too. In 1904, Vega bought out A.C. Fairbanks, who was a well-respected banjo manufacturer, and so they kept building them under his name for a while, but they were also coming up with their own designs, too. The most famous of which is the tubaphone tone ring. Banjo people will know this one. It's the perforated tone ring. It's got a pretty good reputation. That's a Vega invention. But they built guitars too, not in the same numbers, but they're pretty nicely made. They started off with Martin-ish clones like this. This isn't an X-braced guitar, it's ladder braced, but it's the same size as a Martin O, single O, 13.5 inches across the lower bout. And eventually, I think in the 20s and 30s, they started doing arch tops as well, which were pretty well regarded. They just didn't take over a big percentage of the market, so they're not as well known, but they are respected, and they were at the time. It's interesting, a lot of their guitars with flat backs have this really pronounced, weird sort of bulging arch in them. It's like I don't know, hard to describe it. The back is flat, and then there's this cylindrical thing that runs down the center, this bulge. It's far more elegant looking than what I've just described. They're quite nice looking instruments. I'll see if I can find a picture of one. After the Second World War, business started to decline for them. They were doing things like buying bodies from Harmony and putting their own necks on them, sort of an upscale Harmony guitar. Eventually they were bought out by Martin. They kept the Vega name for the banjos, because Pete Seeger played one, and the folk boom, that was money. So Martin built the Vega style banjos for a while, and then eventually Deering bought the name from Martin, and they own it now. So it's a very long and storied history. This one is going under the knife. We're going to make it into a lefty. Yes, I do seem to do a lot of work for left-handed people, or rather the few that I know happen to own a lot of guitars. Let's take a seat in the discussion pond and figure out if it's okay to do this. This is a reasonably rare guitar. There aren't that many of them, and some might argue that it should be preserved because it's in really great shape. But there are a couple of angles. First of all, the owner wants it done. It's his guitar. He can do what he wants with it. And if someone is going to do it, it might as well be me, because I'm capable of doing it cleanly. The other thing is, this work is mostly reversible. All I do is plug the existing saddle slot and cut a replacement going in the opposite direction. And on an ebony bridge like this, it's difficult to see when I'm done. I don't leave very many footprints. But in the event that someone wants to switch it back, it's not hard. It might need a new nut, and just replug the saddle slot, cut it in its original position, and away you go. We're not messing with the bracing or changing the design in a way that's irretrievable. Like if someone came and asked me to change this into a 12-string, or maybe, install a pickup with a big side-mounted EQ box, I would probably politely decline. But to my mind, this isn't desecration. Would I do this to a 1930 Martin OM 45 Deluxe, of which there are less than a dozen in the world? Maybe not, but nobody would ask me to do that. No one in their right mind, anyway. I like the look of these bridges from this era. They're like pyramid bridges with the tops planed off them. Is this the original bridge? I'm not 100% on that. I see little marks here and there around it. Suggest it may have come up at some point and had to be re-glued. And that saddle slot seems kind of wide for this era. I would expect something slightly narrower. But this could be the original bridge. Checking out the intonation, we are a little bit flat on the treble string and quite a bit sharp on the bass string. How to deal with saddle position. Do I replicate exactly what was there previously? What if it's in the wrong place? Prior to the 1930s, manufacturers used less compensation on their saddles. In other words, the saddles don't slant as dramatically as we make them now, and because of that, these tend to play sharp on the bass strings at the 12th fret, the harmonic. At this time, these guitars were meant to be strung with gut strings. These are not steel string guitars. Although we've developed a musical tradition around them that uses steel strings, these are closer to classicals. Julian Bream, classical guitar giant, recently deceased, he made his concertizing debut in 1951 playing a late 19th century Martin. So these have more in common with that world than with bluegrass. Checking out the string length here, we're just under 25 inches, and there is some compensation added for the saddle placement here. And we are going to string this with steel strings, and I know we can get away with that because it's going to be tuned way down to open C using very light strings. As it comes to me, it was an open G, and I think they were using a set of 12 to 54s. They look like elixirs. That's too heavy for this kind of guitar, in my mind. It'll sound great for a year or two, but then it'll really start folding up and the action will get very high. So it's not great. We have to lighten up. In terms of saddle placement, I just use the Stuart McDonald fret position calculator on their website. I plug in the scale length and it gives you the idealized settings for the outside strings. And it's very accurate. I mean, I've never had a problem with it. The way I set it up on these old guitars is rather than using the center of the saddle as the takeoff point, I fudge it a little bit. I use the very front of the saddle for the high string and the very back of the saddle for the low one. That means that it's not angled quite as much, and it can save me, almost a 1/16 of an inch on that low string, because there's very little real estate on some of these narrow bridges. Depending on where the bridge pin holes were drilled, sometimes you can't get it far enough back to intonate properly, and that's okay. There are hundreds of thousands of valuable guitars out there with low E's that don't intonate right on the money. People don't really care that much. Oh, that's nice. It's nice dealing with one that hasn't been glued in. It's not necessary if they're well fit. This saddle is slightly tapered from top to bottom. It's around 107 thousandths at the top, and at the base it's closer to 100 thousandths. Slightly inconsistent along its length. I've got a good, reliable piece of ebony here. This is straight grain stuff with very little run out, and that'll make it easier to plane when it's installed in the bridge. The last thing I want is a piece of wood that will tear out when I get down close to the final surface. This stuff planes easily in both directions, which is why I keep that piece around for this purpose. It fits in there nice and snugly all the way along. I'll get this glued up, and then I want to leave it for a good long time to dry. The longer the better, because if I try to plane and sand it down flush while the wood is still swollen with moisture, it's going to shrink back and you'll see a line. I guess it's one of the secrets to having an almost invisible repair. I was going to try and preserve this nut and maybe just enlarge the lower strings to fit the reversed orientation, but they are a little bit low to begin with, and the spacing is kind of wonky. So I think the best thing to do is just knock this one out and we'll put in a new bone nut. I'm not sure if this was the original nut itself. Some stuff going on in the corners here. Some file marks and stuff that lend me to believe that this might not be original. There's also lacquer that's chipped away from the corner of the nut here, in a way that is unlike any place else on the guitar. So. We'll tap that out and make a nut blank. This is like a martin. The bottom of the nut sits on the angle of the headstock rather than on a flat surface. We'll mark out for the dimensions. I'll saw that pretty close, and then I can refine it using a sanding block to get the angle just right, because it's not square. And polish the ends using micro mesh pads, make them shine. It's good to do this first before putting it onto the guitar. That feels good. This is the half pencil. Of course, this fingerboard is flat, so it shouldn't be too difficult. I should just make a stock montage of nut making scenes and show it in every single video like they do in the Troma films. It would appear over and over again, regardless of the guitar I happen to be working on. It's like, oh, wait a second, I thought that was a 12-string. Got to remember that this is a left-handed nut. It's easier to make that mistake than you think. I'll glue the new nut to the end surface of the fingerboard. This one sits on top of the head plate veneer. There isn't a channel cut for it, so I have to be careful about placement and hold it till the glue cures. It's time to plane down the excess plug material. When I get close to the bridge surface, I use a piece of tape on each side to put the fear into me and keep me from going too deep. I'll switch to a scraper for the last couple of swipes, and then I'll sand the top surface, starting with 220 grit and working up until it's the appropriate level of shiny. Here's a fun operation. I need to pare away the excess overhang, so I'll use a very sharp knife and lots of patience. And then I'll switch to sandpaper wrapped around a dowel to keep the radius and focus on maintaining those sharp transition lines. To make the new saddle slot, I'll start by marking the line of the outside strings and then transfer the scale length with compensation so I'll know where to set my routing jig fence. There's a reason I wait until after the saddle slot has been routed before going ahead and applying a coat of oil to the bridge's top surface to make it look finished, and that's because if I did it before, the masking tape I used for marking the placement wouldn't stick very well. If you're not used to playing without them, having no side dot markers can be a real hindrance, so I'll go ahead and install them on what was once the underside of the neck. I measure, mark them with the awl, and then I'll drill them out with a little tiny hand drill. I like the small 1/16 of an inch dots, 1.5 millimeters. They look a little more elegant to me. The only time I would use the big ones is if it's a Gibson where I have to replicate them. The other thing I've decided is that pearl dots, although they're classy, functionally aren't as visible, and they can vary enough in reflectiveness that it can be visually distracting. So unless someone really wants them, I default to these. I'll pare these down and they'll rub on a little shellac afterwards. There is a crack in the fingerboard running up from the sound hole, and I'm going to fill this. I don't think it's in any danger. It's probably pretty old, but it might be best to get some glue in there, just as a matter of course. So I'm using some fine sanding dust, really getting it into the crack, then I'll dust away all the excess, and I'll drizzle in some thin super glue. I try to be sparing with this, realizing that I'll likely need to do multiple applications. Put some dust in, add the glue, more dust, more glue. And I don't want to build up big globs right up against the frets, because that's difficult and time-consuming to clean off, and I'm trying to make some money. So once that's all dried, I'll use the razor blade scraper. I don't turn or put a hook on the edge because I don't need an aggressive cut here. I just want to be very delicate. And after that I'll sand and polish up to something that resembles the wood around it. Back to the nut making montage, slotting to the final depth and sanding. When setting up a guitar with a slotted headstock, it can be a lot faster to keep the strings on and tape over them, protecting the headstock with cardboard, because otherwise you'll be there all day putting strings on and taking them off. So we're all set up here. I'm very happy with the way it turned out. There's a subtly intonated saddle there. And most importantly, it's not glaringly obvious that this is a replacement saddle slot. Blends in quite convincingly. This time I got smart and took some video footage before I transformed it into a lefty. Using the old noggin. So we'll give it a try. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.